Back here on the show now to jump right into some more contract talks around the Dallas Cowboys and how it's going, how it's progressing so far. Not too much progression so far, but we got some words from Stephen Jones on the level of optimism, just a general feeling on where these things are heading into really the start of training camp now, because they will report to their first day of camp tomorrow on Wednesday, where there also will be the first practice on the following day on Thursday. So we're at this point where we're getting closer and closer to football, the most football-like environment we've seen up until now. And generally, the optimism, the thought around everything is that CeeDee Lamb, one part of this three-part issue for the Dallas Cowboys, probably won't be there at training camp, will still be holding out. But Dak Prescott will be there, and he is where I wanted to start because Stephen Jones spoke about the overall view on the pending extensions for their big three, CeeDee, Dak, and Micah Parsons. He spoke on it on the Athletics Scoop City podcast, on Friday. And on that note, on just a general overview of the entire thing, he said that we're having conversations with his agent, with Dak personally, both Jerry and myself. He knows our goal is to keep him here. He also understands the challenges, and you see what happens to teams when you do have these top-priced quarterbacks. At some point, it is a challenge to keep everybody, and off of that comment, he mentioned that he compared it to the Chiefs a little bit, mentioning how Tyreek and the Chiefs had to move on from one another in order for Tyreek to get that massive deal, top-of-the-market deal to reset the entire market with the Miami Dolphins. He also brought up the fact that, same thing with L'Jarius Sneed and the Chiefs, that he had to move on. Even though he was franchise tagged, it was a tough decision that the Chiefs had to make, so that they had to move on from him, arguably their number one corner. Now he signs a top-of-the-market deal with the Tennessee Titans, but the fact that he brought those up is kind of contrary with what he's saying overall, because he is optimistic about extending all of them and not really making those tough decisions like the Kansas City Chiefs had to do. But again, he says he remains optimistic on extending all three of them. He has some leeway with Micah just because that's not until probably next offseason or the following at that. But right now, the main focus is CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, which both of them could make an argument to reset the markets or at least make the top of the market price that currently stands for both of their positional groups. And off of that, on the topic of CeeDee, I thought it was interesting that Stephen Jones brought up the fact that, of course, CeeDee Lamb is going to want something close to Justin Jefferson, obviously looking at how that all worked out for the Minnesota Vikings and Justin Jefferson to reset the market completely, jumping from A.J. Brown's $32 million per year all the way up to $35. That's great for Justin Jefferson, but he had the caveat of comparing it to the Minnesota Vikings and saying that, the Vikings don't have anybody else other than Justin Jefferson now making anywhere over $20 million per year, whereas the Cowboys, have Trayvon Diggs at $19 million per year, Zach Martin up there at around $20 million, DeMarcus Lawrence also up there in a high-priced contract, and Dak Prescott too, who was already extended about 4 years ago, all making close to the top or near the top of the top earners at their position. So that is something that he wanted to bring up as sort of a caveat to know, yeah, CeeDee Lamb might want the same as Justin Jefferson, but the way the teams are set up, the way the contracts are set up with each team, a lot more hurdles for the Dallas Cowboys to get to that point than it is for the Minnesota Vikings. They only really had to worry about getting to the price of Justin Jefferson, and you saw that the consequences of that was moving on from Kirk Cousins. Ironically, the Falcons gave him a lot of money in order for him to be the starter in his mind, but then they drafted Michael Penix. Would have been the exact same situation that it was in Minnesota, but those situations ironically played out. But sticking to the Dallas Cowboys and Stephen Jones talking more about this roster makeup, this challenge of building this team out and having developing players play a major role more so going forward. Already, they've seen some of their developmental players like a Tyler Biotic leave in free agency, and Stephen Jones admitted that the fact that they had to do that they drafted him, developed him into a solid player, someone that you'd love to keep on your roster forever for their entire career. He said that it was a hard decision to have to move on from him, but that they just simply couldn't fit him, and that they don't like seeing some of these young players move on from that because you have to deal with these contract negotiations for some of the top earners projected in their position in CeeDee, in Dak, and Micah Parsons. But the fact that he did mention that, he just wanted to emphasize that he wants to continue to do that ideally, not only because, that is something you want to do, that is something you take pride in doing, knowing that you drafted him, evaluated a player, and developed him into somebody that you can call a top of their position player. He emphasized relying on guys like Tyler Guyton, who they drafted this year, Marshawn Nealand as well, a pass rusher for them, to try and relieve some of this cap space, to not always have to pay top of the market money to have a good roster. But it starts to back up on you a little bit now. They're at that point now where they have to make a decision, going back to that point that Stephen Jones made about the Chiefs and how they had to relinquish some of their best players in order to work something out in terms of keeping Chris Jones or keeping other players on their team, extending maybe Patrick Mahomes at the time. They had to part ways with some very reliable players, some top of the food chain like players in Tyreek and L'Jarius Sneed. And that's something that right now the Cowboys are trying to figure out as they start training camp. But on that topic, on now moving over to this idea of the Super Bowl window that I wanted to bring up, because I've talked endlessly about this Cowboys team heading into 2024. Jerry Jones saying that they're all in way back in like March or something like that, to now where we are right now. Yeah, they're all in. At the start, I didn't really believe that based on what they were doing, but now all in is starting to become, in my mind, this Super Bowl window. Is it about to close, or is it really threatening to close on the Dallas Cowboys at this point based on what we've seen this offseason and just based on the nature of their team? Because Stephen Jones also cleared up one point that a lot of their players, a lot of their major pieces on this team, like CeeDee and Dak obviously, but also their coaches, their entire coaching staff, and Mike McCarthy are all on one-year deals. So that really doesn't scream the fact that this team is planning anything past this 1 year. And that's not an ideal situation you want to work out in, sort of that lame duck year that everybody labels it as. But he wanted to clear up that it doesn't mean that they don't have faith in them to finally get over this playoff hurdle, this playoff curse that they've had to deal with over the last, almost 3 decades. He wanted to clear that up. He wanted to bring that to light. And also, I hate this point that they always bring up. I heard Jerry Jones talk about it. I think I actually might have heard Stephen Jones mention it prior. To sort of back that up and have confidence and show his confidence in this staff, some of the players that they are trying to get these negotiations done with, he brought up the point that over the last 3 years, they've had 3 12-win regular seasons in those 3 years, obviously adding up to 36 wins in the last 3 years. And he said that at some point that should be recognized as something, I guess, to hang your hat on. But now that leads me into more of this Super Bowl window question, because like I said, I don't like that point. I don't like that because it's almost like a cop-out. He says it's something that it has to be recognized, but it's not so much recognized with the Cowboys, because if you compare to somebody else who has double-digit wins, who has continuously been at the top of the NFC, like the 49ers, they're a team that's recognized for it, because when you dominate so much in the regular season, they follow it up with good performances in the playoffs, exceeding some expectations, like when Brock Purdy came in, and they still made it to a conference championship before he got hurt. Then right after that, they followed it up with a Super Bowl. They've been in and out of the Super Bowl, the NFC Championship game, for the last 4 or 5 years or something like that. They're a team that you can say, yeah, they've had double-digit wins in the regular season. Wow, that's impressive. It is a fair point to bring up the fact that hanging around the rim in terms of the Cowboys right now it's getting to a point where that's just not good enough. Honestly, if you want to be in the same status as the 49ers, even the Detroit Lions, for an example, just because I think they're just starting their Super Bowl window, hanging around the rim does you no good because you don't get anywhere else past that point. The Cowboys, because of who they are, the Cowboys, their legacy and everything like that, they don't get trophies, they don't get medals or anything like that. They don't get the recognition for having a good regular season just based on their history, the 5 Super Bowls that they have. That's just not the standard, and unless you want to lower that standard, which would be an absolute travesty for this organization, you can't hang your hat on that. You can't hang your hat on just having great regular seasons, being solid in the regular season, and then laying an egg every time you make it to the playoffs. We're at that point right now where I think that Super Bowl window, honestly, is threatening on closing. Like it does with all great teams, going back to the Kansas City Chiefs point that Stephen Jones brought up. You could have argued that at one point, once they moved on from Tyreek Hill, some might have looked at this team, just even last year, looked at this team like, oh, maybe they're not all there yet. This is one of the worst offenses that Patrick Mahomes has had to play with. Are they really true contenders with this team? They responded to moving on from Tyreek Hill. They moved on from the Jerry Sneed this season, and they responded with winning a Super Bowl last year. Now this year, they added Marquise Brown. They developed Rashee Rice. They drafted Xavier Worthy. They responded to all those questions about it. And also the same thing with the 49ers. Now they're closer to where the Cowboys are right now because I think they are trying to keep that window open just a little bit because they have to deal with Brandon Ayuk next year, Deebo Samuel, and other players that they have to extend, Brock Purdy as well. They're going to have to respond in a way because you have this period of having a lot of good young players in your team, and the Cowboys have had it for such a long time now that now in 2024, where there are some of your best players threatening to leave, this Super Bowl window now is really threatening on closing unless they do something about it. And once they do something about it, if it is a big decision like moving on from Dak or moving on from CeeDee, they have to respond and back their decision up in any way that they can because I believe that they just have to lose a star, honestly, like the Chiefs did as the best example, because I don't see how you win a Super Bowl, and that's obviously still the standard with the Cowboys, if you have the highest paid quarterback, the highest paid receiver, and the highest paid maybe outside linebacker or pass rusher, but everybody else is just average to below average in terms of talent in the league. I don't think you could do that. I don't think they could win with that makeup of a roster. They have a lot of issues to address. Wide receiver depth, quality at running back, their offensive line, they lost a couple starters. So, yeah, it's something that they have to get going on, obviously, but to have optimism on all three, I don't think that's really where this team should be at right now. Is it the end of their Super Bowl window? I think once that big decision finally drops, once they extend somebody or they don't extend any of them in this offseason, then we're going to get a better understanding, a better answer on that. But for right now, I'm still indecisive on it, just because they might surprise me and extend somebody or do something that they haven't done all offseason. But we're definitely going to touch on it later on this week or later on in the offseason. But we're going to end that topic there. We're going to head into another break, and once we come back, the second half of the show will have topics on Jordan Love. I'm going to explain more on his holdout, being the first quarterback to hold out this offseason, and also just some other updates around other quarterbacks as we start training camp. Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, and Daniel Jones. Some pretty important pieces of news around them that I wanted to explain to you guys at the end of the show, so we'll be right back on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.